Today is the day of Donnie Swaggart's funeral. The world may have known it was coming, but when it finally arrived, something still felt heavy. Donnie Swaggart passed away on July 1st, 2025. At the age of 90, he died peacefully in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, surrounded by his family. For many who had grown up listening to his voice, watching his broadcasts, and hearing his music in the background of their lives, it was more than the loss of a preacher. It was the end of a chapter. 12 days later, on July 12th, the funeral service was held at Family Worship Center, the sanctuary where he had preached for decades. From early morning, people began gathering outside. There were no crowds pushing forward, no reporters shouting questions, just quiet, steady footsteps. People came with purpose, holding tissues, photographs, old gospel records, or simply their memories. Some arrived from nearby towns. Others flew in from distant cities and countries. Pastors, families, elderly couples, young children who had only known his name through stories. They weren't there for spectacle. They were there because this man, in one way or another, had touched their lives. Outside the building, large white tents had been set up for the overflow. Under them, screens streamed the service live. The Louisiana heat pressed down, but no one complained. Some stood in prayer. Others watched silently, eyes focused on the image of a closed casket displayed inside. Inside the church, every seat was filled. More than 7,000 people sat in stillness, their faces solemn. The lights were low. The atmosphere felt more like a sacred pause than a public event. At the center of the stage was the casket, closed, draped in soft white and gold cloth. On either side stood tall arrangements of lilies and hydrangeas, simple, elegant, and intentional. The pulpit behind the casket stood untouched. No microphone, no spotlight. The same space where Donnie Swaggart once stood with trembling voice and passionate conviction now stood in silence. And yet, in that stillness, he was everywhere. Frances Swaggart sat in the front row, dressed in black. Her presence, quiet but strong. More than 70 years of marriage had given her a seat no one else could fill. Next to her sat their son, Donnie, composed but clearly moved. The weight of continuing the ministry now rested entirely on his shoulders. Today, though, wasn't about leadership or legacy. It was about letting go. A soft piano melody filled the room. No lyrics, just the familiar chords of a gospel tune Donnie had once played himself. For those who had followed him over the years, it was enough to bring back 100 memories. Moments of prayer, of surrender, of sitting alone at Night, while his voice reminded them they weren't alone. There were no introductions needed in the room. No titles, no status, just people. People who remembered being broken and finding comfort in his preaching. People who cried when he cried. People who knew his story not because they read it in headlines, but because they lived parts of it. In their own hearts, strangers leaned on each other without speaking. Tissues were passed down, rows without asking. The room was quiet, but full of emotion, full of history, full of the kind of connection that only grief and gratitude can create. The presence of Jimmy Swaggart wasn't in the lights or the decor. It was in the atmosphere, in the way people sat, hands folded, eyes lowered, in the way no one moved too quickly. No one whispered or checked their phones. Even the staff walked slowly, as if every step held weight. There were no dramatic gestures, no grand entrances. The morning unfolded naturally, the way sacred moments do without effort. Outside, the crowd continued to grow. Under the tents, people stood shoulder to shoulder. They didn't need to be inside the building to feel what was happening. They already felt it, and yet, despite the sorrow, there was peace. Not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that tells you it's okay to mourn, that it's okay to be quiet, that it's okay to simply be present. Jimmy Swaggart had not been a perfect man, but he had been real. And for decades, he had given people permission to believe, to cry, to come back after falling. That's why they came today. Not to mourn a flawless life, but to honor a faithful one. As the music faded, the sanctuary remained still. No one rushed. No one filled the silence with noise. Everyone just waited for the service to begin, for memories to settle, for the weight of goodbye to land gently. And in that moment, you understood what kind of man he really was. Not because of what was said, but because of who showed up, and how they stood, and what they felt. That's how the day began. Quietly, together, in the presence of a man who gave his entire life to reaching people land today. Brought them all back one last time. Jimmy Swaggart was born on March 15, 1935. In Fairy Day, Louisiana, a small town, a modest family. Nothing about his beginnings hinted at what he would become. He grew up in poverty, no luxury, no spotlight. Just music, faith, and struggle. As a boy, he taught himself how to play the piano by ear. By the age of 8, he could fill a room with melody, even if he couldn't read a single note. He wasn't polished, he was raw. But people listened, as he grew, so did his passion, not just for music, but for preaching. By his late teens, he was already speaking in small revival meetings. He had no formal training, no major backing, just conviction, tears, and the sound of gospel in his fingers. He married Frances at just 17 years old, and together they started their ministry with nothing but a Bible, a piano, and a car that barely ran. There were years they couldn't afford a home, so they lived in that car, preaching at night, driving by day, surviving on offerings that barely covered gas. But what they lacked in comfort, they made up for in calling. They believed God had something for them, even if the world hadn't seen it yet. And then, slowly, people began to notice. By the 1970s, Jimmy's ministry was gaining momentum. His emotional style of preaching, his music, and his transparency struck a nerve with people who were tired of polished religion. They wanted something real, something they could feel. Jimmy didn't just talk about God, he wept, he trembled, he broke down mid-sermon. And that vulnerability made people believe he meant every word. In the 1980s, his rise was undeniable. The Jimmy Swaggart telecast was broadcast weekly in over 100 countries. His crusades filled stadiums. His gospel albums sold in the millions. He became one of the most recognized televangelists in the world. His face was everywhere. His voice reached homes, prisons, churches, and hotels. People watched him on Sunday mornings and fell asleep to his songs at night. But with visibility came pressure, and with pressure came cracks. In 1988, everything changed. News broke that Swaggart had been involved in a prostitution scandal. The man known for preaching fire and holiness had been caught in a moment that didn't match his message. The headlines were brutal. The media swarmed. His ministry credentials were revoked by the Assemblies of God. Former allies distanced themselves. And critics, both inside and outside the church, lined up to say it was over. But something unexpected happened. He didn't disappear. He stood on stage in front of the world and said 3 words that would follow him forever. I have sinned. It wasn't a strategic statement. It wasn't polished or rehearsed. He cried. He broke down. Millions watched it live. Some were angry, some disappointed, but others saw something they recognized. A man who had built a platform with tears was now breaking in front of it. Publicly, for years, the consequences played out. Swaggart lost partners. His reputation was battered. His ministry shrank. But through it all, he kept doing one thing, preaching, not to regain fame, not to prove anything, but because that's what he had always done. In the years that followed, he built something different. Sun Life Broadcasting Network was born his own channel, his own space, free from denominational ties. He preached regularly at Family Worship Center, still sitting at his piano, still singing the same songs, still crying at the same altars. The audience was smaller, the camera angles simpler, but the spirit was the same. He no longer had the attention of the world, but he had the attention of those who never stopped believing in redemption. People often asked, how could he continue after so much failure? The answer was simple. He never claimed to be the message. He only tried to deliver it. And when he failed, he didn't run. He just kept showing up. That's what made his story different. He didn't finish perfect. He finished present. He didn't rewrite history. He carried it. He didn't rebuild an empire. He rebuilt a connection between himself and those who knew what it felt like to be broken and still loved, between guilt and grace, between shame and worship. Over time, people softened. New listeners discovered his sermons online. His music resurfaced in playlists. Some who once turned away quietly came back, not to praise him, but to honor the part of them that still needed his voice. Jimmy Swaggart's life was never a straight line, was full of highs and full of pain. And he fell harder than most ever could. But the miracle wasn't in the rise or the fall. It was in the fact that he got back up and kept going. The sanctuary stayed silent as Donnie Swaggart rose from his seat. All eyes turned to warn him, but no one moved. This wasn't just the son of Jimmy Swaggart standing before them. This was a man carrying the weight of both legacy and loss. His steps to the pulpit were slow, his voice steady but low. And as he began to speak, there was no performance, just honesty. He said, "My father wasn't perfect, but he didn't hide. He didn't give up. He stood back up, again and again. Not for applause, but because he believed people still needed the truth." The room didn't respond with noise. No clapping, no murmurs. The kind of silence where everyone's heart is doing its own remembering. Donnie continued, talking not just about the preacher, but the father. The man who would rehearse his music long after midnight. The man who taught him how to cry during a sermon, not because it looked good, but because it meant something real was happening. At one point, his voice caught slightly, but he didn't stop. He said, "My dad showed us all what it means to lose everything and still choose to serve." He was a public man who lived through private pain, and yet he never stopped pointing people back to the cross. After the final word, Donnie stepped away from the pulpit. He didn't linger. He didn't look back. And the church stayed quiet, not because they didn't know what to say, but because sometimes grief is best honored in silence. Moments later, the choir stood. No announcement, no dramatic music cue. Just a soft swell of voices rising from the stage. They began to sing. "There's a River," one of Jimmy's most personal songs. A song he had sung hundreds of times, always at the piano, eyes closed, trembling hands on the keys. But this time, it wasn't his voice, and somehow that made it even harder to hear. The lyrics filled the sanctuary like a wave, not loud, just full. People began to cry. Softly, quietly. Some held their heads low, others lifted their hands. It wasn't a concert. A farewell in harmony. As the final note faded, the screens in the sanctuary lit up. A tribute video began to play. No narration, just images, moments, black and white clips of a young Jimmy preaching under a tent, baptizing new believers in rivers, sitting at a dusty piano in churches that barely had electricity. Then the clips shifted: stadiums, crusades, foreign countries, his voice echoing through speakers, his hands lifted toward the sky. Footage from the 1980s showed him preaching to crowds that filled entire arenas, singing through tears, collapsing into prayer. Then older clips, slower steps, softer voice, but the same fire in his eyes. The final image held on the screen just a little longer than the rest. Jimmy Swaggart, alone on stage, sitting at the piano, head bowed, eyes closed, and beneath that image, just one sentence appeared: "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." No one in the sanctuary moved. Then came the moment everyone had been dreading: the final walk. 6 men approached the casket. Quietly, reverently. As they lifted it, the entire room rose to their feet. Not out of custom, not because they were told to, but because some moments are sacred, and standing is the only thing left to do. No applause, no sound, just the slow, careful movement of a casket carried through the same aisles where Jimmy had once preached about forgiveness, mercy, and second chances. Outside the building, the hearse waited. The sun had risen higher, but the air remained still. The burial was held privately at Green Oaks Memorial Park, a short drive from the church. Only immediate family and close staff attended. A small white tent had been set up beside the grave. No platform, no cameras, just those who had walked with him through everything: his wife, his son, his team. As the casket was lowered into the ground, a soft version of "I Surrender" all played from a small speaker nearby. Francis stood with quiet resolve. "Donnie, read a brief scripture." No one gave a speech. There were no final announcements, just a white rose, a closing prayer, and a moment of peace. Jimmy Swaggart is gone, but his presence remains quiet, steady, and unforgettable. He wasn't remembered because he was flawless. He was remembered because he was faithful. Because even when the world turned its back, he kept showing up. Not to reclaim applause, but to keep delivering a message that mattered. He sang with tears. He preached through storms. He fell in front of the world and still stood again. For many, he was more than a preacher. Companion through late nights, long drives, and silent battles. His voice came through when no one else knew what to say. And even now, long after his final words have been spoken, his message is still reaching hearts. If you ever felt seen through his sermons, if you ever cried during one of his songs, if he ever reminded you that grace is stronger than guilt, then carry that forward. Let it live in you. And if this is the first time you've heard his story, don't stop here. Go listen. Go remember. Go discover the voice that helped millions find their way back when everything felt lost. Share his story. Hurting with someone who feels like their failure disqualified them. Because sometimes one broken voice is all it takes to bring healing to another. Jimmy's voice has fallen silent in this world, but his message, his cry for mercy, for second chances, for love that never lets go still speaks. Let someone hear it one more time.